Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya Lothian-McLean. I'm joined tonight. I'm putting myself in the capable hands of Michael Walker as my co-host. Michael, hello.
I'm putting myself in your capable hands. I'm really looking forward to tonight's show. Another evening of Tory chaos and collapse.
Yeah, quite. I mean, if I'm putting myself in your hands and you're putting yourself in my hands, who's driving this thing? That would be James Fox, our producer. Coming up later tonight in the show, how the Labour Party have allegedly tried to gag Martin Forde for speaking out about the party's failure to tackle racism. We'll also be talking about how the Israeli military have seemingly broken ranks with the Israeli government on their objectives for the war in Gaza. And we look at the debate on the state of the NHS that featured exasperated members of the public on BBC Newsnight. Stay tuned for all of that. The Tory general election campaign has so far been pretty chaotic and desperate. But today, with just 2 weeks to go until polling day, the campaign has hit a remarkable new low, with the party essentially conceding defeat to Labour. The Times' political correspondent reports this. Exclusive. CCHQ is now briefing candidates to sell its message about impending defeat. The latest diktat from CRD says they should warn against handing Labour a blank cheque and the party having no one to stop them. Only the Conservatives can win enough seats to prevent an unaccountable Labour majority is now the party's official line. Ambitious. So that's their message in the air war. We're losing, but make sure that we're still the opposition party. However, what about the ground war? Well, Bloomberg has some of the details, reporting this. Conservative campaign headquarters on Wednesday told Tory candidates in several constituencies who are defending majorities of over 10,000 votes that their funds and favourable access to party activists was being withdrawn, according to the people who spoke on condition of anonymity. Those resources would be directed to other Tory-held districts with even larger majorities that the party believes it has a better chance of winning, candidates were told. The same decision has been taken with a number of similar seats, some with lower majorities, the people said. I love the use of the people there. Can you hear the people whine about the redirection of funds? Yes, I can. Just let that sink in, though, for a moment. The Tories are in such trouble that they've decided seats with a 10,000 strong majority are unwinnable. And one Tory MP with an even bigger majority is clearly worried about his future. Rishi Sunak's Yorkshire seat of Richmond has been Tory since 1931. It's the definition of a safe seat, with the Prime Minister winning a 27,000-seat majority in 2019. Apparently, that's not safe enough in 2024, with Bloomberg reporting this. Sunak will get additional resources in his own constituency of Richmond and Northallerton, the People said, after a poll by Savantas suggested he was in danger of becoming the first Premier in British history to lose his seat. Cannot get Les Miserables out of my head when they say the People. Pretty bleak, though, for the Tories so far. Although maybe Rishi Sunak would be pleased to lose his seat so he can go to California without any more jokes or any other choices. But this next part of the Conservative campaign collapse is astonishing. The party's director of campaigning, Tony Lee, has just taken an unexpected leave of absence with only 2 weeks left to polling day. Lee, pictured here on the right, is reportedly under investigation by the Gambling Commission along with his wife, Laura Saunders. Laura Saunders is also the Conservative Party's candidate in Bristol North West. The investigation concerns an alleged bet relating to the date of the general election. The gambling regulator said this. Currently, the Commission is investigating the possibility of offences concerning the date of the election. This is an ongoing investigation and the Commission cannot provide any details at this time. We're not confirming or denying the identity of any individuals involved in this investigation. If this story rings a bell, just please note that Lee and Saunders are actually a different pair to the MP who we learned last week was being investigated by the Gambling Commission. That was Craig Williams, Rishi Sunak's private parliamentary secretary and Tory MP for Montgomeryshire. Williams confirmed last week that he placed a £100 bet on a July election just 3 days before Sunak called it. And it seems it's not just Tory politicians allegedly having remarkably accurate flutters just days before Sunak announced the election. A police officer in Rishi Sunak's close protection team has been arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office over alleged general election date bets. Obviously, the allegations that people close to Rishi Sunak were taking advantage of sensitive information from the Prime Minister to enrich themselves hardly serves the Tories' reputation. But it hardly serves their electoral campaign either, with the party suddenly backtracking on this social media campaign ad. If you bet on Labour, you can never win. And for listeners at home, there's a picture of, I think it's a roulette table. I've never gambled in my life. Fox is telling me it's a roulette table. You cannot make this stuff up. And nor can you make up just how catastrophic the election is shaping up to be for the Tories. In the last 48 hours, we've had 3 MRP polls making one dire prediction for the Conservatives after another. YouGov's latest seat projection shows the Tories on track for the lowest seat total in history, with just 108 seats. A separate Ipsos Mori poll gave the Tories 115 seats, and a Savanta poll had them on an extinction level 53 seats. One can pray. All of those scenarios would be the worst ever election result in Tory history. Sorry, I need to stop smiling. Worse than in 1906 when they won just 156 seats, and worse than in 1997 when they clung on to 165. But one senior Tory believes all is not yet lost. Michael Gove has appeared on Sky News, where Kay Burley asked him this.
Why do people not want to vote Conservative at this election?
Well, again, we'll see on polling day. So, again, there are opinion polls, as I've acknowledged and as we both know, they're not great. But it's not the 90th minute. We're not in Fergie time yet. So there is still an opportunity.
We are.
There is still an opportunity for us to make these arguments.
Very squeaky bums at Downing Street.
And as we make these arguments, my experience, and I know it's just me and a range of seats, not every seat in the country. My experience is that when you do talk to voters, outline some of the tax dangers, outline some of Labour's plans for the future, then people do think twice.
I mean, let's note that Michael Gove is standing down at this election, but other Michael, not Michael Gove, Michael, is this delusion from Gove, or can they really pull off a comeback? Or is this a secret Govian third thing?
I don't think it's delusion because I don't think he believes it. I mean, he's going on television and giving a performance, isn't he? You can't really, as a cabinet member, sort of say, no, we are definitely screwed. I think he's putting on a brave face. Also, not a man who is too afraid of being disingenuous, I think. So reportedly, when Sunak was sort of having that big meeting with his cabinet where he was deciding whether or not to have this disastrous snap election, Michael Gove sort of said, destiny rewards the brave. And then 2 days later, without having told Sunak, he was like, oh, by the way, I'm not going to stand in this catastrophic, stupid election. That would just be embarrassing. So I'm not sure how seriously we should take what he says on this. I mean, I suppose another thing to say is that, the Conservatives' new line, because it seems that they obviously don't think they're going to win this general election. They know they're going to lose it. And they've switched to a somewhat desperate line, which is that we shouldn't give Labour a supermajority. Now, there's a few problems with this. I mean, a supermajority, the word super is quite positive. I don't think people necessarily mind the idea of having, to me, that sounds like strong government, doesn't it? So I think people don't want the Conservatives. They're not that scared of Labour. A strong Labour government, who cares? Go for it. Also, it just doesn't really mean anything in the context of this country because the debate we're having is whether Labour will have a majority of like 150 or 250. Now, either of those means you can pass whatever law you want, right? It's exactly the same in terms of how Labour will govern. And it would be different in certain systems. So there are some systems, say the United States, often in presidential systems, actually sort of have a clause where if you have 2/3 of the legislature, you can change the constitution. But we don't have a constitution, so having 2/3 of the legislature means absolutely nothing. So the only thing that's really in play now, the difference between a 250 majority and a 150 majority is the size of the Tory opposition. If the Tories get 50 MPs, their future is very much in doubt. If they get 150 MPs, they can probably rebuild. So if you are a reform voter, if what you want is for the right to be constituted in this country, then absolutely you should be trying to punish the Conservatives. Right? I suppose for someone on the left, it's very difficult to know, what do you prefer? Do you want to see the Conservatives on 50 seats, which would probably empower Nigel Farage? Or do you want, Rishi Sunak to be on 150, which people in his circle will be able to sort of say, put on a brave face? Like, I kind of want to just see them humiliated and throw the dice, but I'm not sure if that's sort of my head or my heart speaking. But yeah, I don't think they've got any line whatsoever which is going to encourage people to vote for them. People aren't scared of Labour. They know Labour are going to win anyway, and they want to give the Conservatives a punishment beating.
Yeah, it is really difficult to know which is the preferred outcome, because I think human beings find it difficult to envisage both a better world, but also sometimes they're like, well, things won't get that bad, things won't change. And, 14 years later, after our first Tories got into government, we can say that, yes, they do get worse, and they get measurably worse in ways that you can't even imagine at the time. So the idea of reform being the official opposition, and the idea of having hard rights, which we obviously have now in the form of the Tories, but having such naked hard rights take that position is scary to me. But also we live in this, terrible stagnant two-party system. And maybe change is good, but I don't think change has really worked out that well as historically in the 20th century. Also, in the supermajority, they mentioned the 2/3, how it applies to the US. Every election, in fact, general politics, we love to just parachute in some meaningless term from the US that doesn't apply here. And then the tabloids or the broadsheets go crazy over it. And then it enters common parlance when talking about politics, even though it has no relevance to UK, the way the UK politics is set up. And supermajority is the one for this year. But the predictions of imminent devastation have led some Tories into utter fantasy. This was Nadine Dorries. Will Sunak step down at the weekend and ask @David Cameron to step in? Would he rather be an MP who loses his seat rather than the first PM to lose in living history? The day after the night before is an issue. The party will be in freefall. DC won't want to do so, but he is a man who has a strong sense of public duty and experience who would put party before self. Just a thought. I know Nadine Dorries is so active on the fan fiction forums. She writes books, but I know she's also out there on the fan fiction. She's on Wattpad. And she's just typing. And if anyone finds the particular fan fiction she's written here about David Cameron at the last minute stepping in to be Prime Minister just 2 weeks before an election, can you please just send it to us anonymously? That would be great. I'm sure it'll be published anyway and in a local The Works by December. A top lawyer who authored an investigation into Labour's internal culture has accused the party of trying to gag him after he criticised failures to implement his recommendations. The Independent reports that Martin Forde, KC, was sent a letter by lawyers representing Labour who warned he was, quote, acting against the party's interests. Forde was the author of the Forde Report. Quick reminder, the Forde Report was commissioned in 2020 by Keir Starmer. The inquiry was investigating the leak of an internal report which alleged factionalism on the right of the party during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership had hindered attempts to deal with anti-Semitism and undermined election performance in 2017. The Forde Report's publication was much delayed, but it was finally released in 2022. It was highly critical of factionalism on both sides and found that discrimination and racism were made worse by infighting. One major line from the Forde Report was that Labour's commitment to tackling anti-Semitism was not matched by efforts to tackle other forms of racism, such as that experienced by Black and Muslim members of the party. Since the publication of the Forde Report, Martin Forde has been pretty critical of how Labour has dealt with his 165 recommendations. In an interview with Al Jazeera last year, he described a, quote, hierarchy of racism. And he said that Labour's response had been non-existent.
I've had very limited communication with the General Secretary, David Evans, but that was really housekeeping. I have spoken to a caucus of Black Labour Party MPs in the House of Commons. Other than that, I've not spoken to anybody within the party machinery.
Well, Labour did respond with the threat of legal action against Martin Forde. The Independent discovered that Labour sent Forde a, quote, robust legal letter that accused him of acting against party interests and warned him that Labour was, quote, considering all of its options. Lawyers representing Labour also alleged Forde had made extensive, negative and highly prejudicial comments and apparently questioned his professional conduct. Forde said the letter contained an indication that Labour's lawyers might report him to his regulatory body. He said, I don't know if it was an attempt to silence me. I mean, they've couched it carefully along the lines of, we're reminding you of your professional duties, which I found mildly irritating because I am a regulatory lawyer and I don't like my professionalism or my ethics being questioned. But I felt it was more. I'm a private individual. They can't silence me. I fundamentally object to people saying to me, you don't know how to behave as a professional. I'm afraid black professionals get it all the time. In reply to Labour's veiled threat, Forde responded via his own lawyers, who deemed the allegations, quote, baseless. He hasn't heard from Labour since. For its part, Labour says it has implemented the majority of Forde's recommendations. However, the party has rejected some key suggestions, including adopting blind recruitment processes and measures that would reduce the ability for factions to constantly battle each other for power. Michael, this story might seem a little bound up in the levers of power for most people, but why does it matter?
There's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? So should people care? And I suppose one thing you can say is this is very sort of bad behaviour by the party that's going to become in government. Will they do this in power? The other thing, I suppose, is how frustrating this is, because this is an issue that people really did care about 5 years ago. So sort of the internal complaints procedure in the Labour Party for about 5 years, or let's say sort of the latter part of Corbyn's leadership, was seen as one of the key issues of national importance. Sort of, how does the Labour Party deal with its complaints process? This is front page of the newspapers every week. You know, this is one of the biggest issues of the day. And then you've got this issue where sort of Keir Starmer is doing something that would have been, imagine if this had been done under, with Corbyn in power, Jenny Formby in the party, where they'd got, you know, a Jewish person to write a report about how the Labour Party was dealing with anti-Semitism. They then ignore the report. They then say to the prestigious lawyer who's written this, oh, you're actually talking too much in public about how we've ignored the report. We're going to threaten you with legal consequences, right? That would have been major. And if that had been, you know, revealed during the period of a general election, that would have dominated, especially the 2019 campaign, for about a week, right? So just the double standards here. I can actually see why, you know, you might say as someone, look, I don't care about the internal workings of a political party, but let's have some consistent. I mean, I do, right? But I am a political nerd. But we need to have some consistency here, where what people thought was a major issue 5 years ago suddenly is just, oh, who cares? And we should be clear what's happened here. Martin Forde wrote a very critical report of the Labour Party. He was asked to write it by the Labour Party. The Labour Party completely ignored it because it wasn't in line with what the faction in charge of the Labour Party wanted to do. And now they're threatening him to shut up about them ignoring it. I mean, I do think it is completely disgraceful.
I mean, you heard it here first. Michael Walker is a political nerd. My follow-up to this, though, is, and I've said this quite elsewhere because it's always stuck with me, which is, you know, Cita Blind said it to me, which is, she said, we're the only side that's burdened with coherence. We're the only one who carry the burden of coherence. I don't even think the left adhere much to coherence nowadays. But how do you get people to be consistent? What would it take for, you know, people to be consistent in the way they might have viewed Jeremy Corbyn's Labour and the way they view Starmer's Labour? And who do you think matters when they are consistent? Is it the media? Is it, you know, these politicians? Where do we need this consistency from? Where should we be pushing for consistency?
Well, I'm not sure we can. I suppose you can push for it just in sort of pointing it out. I mean, in terms of why there is a difference, it's one part of it is because the media are more sort of aligned with Keir Starmer. One might also talk about a hierarchy of racism. I think the main issue is that the Westminster media take their sort of lead from the parliamentary parties. So the reason why sort of the complaints procedure became a big issue under Jeremy Corbyn is because there were MPs threatening to leave. And those MPs who threatened to leave wouldn't have been isolated because you had a very large mass of MPs who were hostile to Jeremy Corbyn. So it was a parliamentary crisis, a Westminster crisis. So the anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, I tend to call it the anti-Semitism row, was basically something that political reporters were reporting upon because lots of MPs were telling them this is a big deal. Now, because lots of MPs aren't telling them this is a big deal, or not at least enough MPs to possibly challenge Starmer's authority, they don't care. So, you know, you can be cynical about it. They care about this kind of racism. They don't care about that kind of racism. They wanted to attack the left-wing leader. They don't want to attack a centrist leader. Essentially, they just report on beef among the parliamentary Labour Party. So if it's made an issue by MPs, they'll report it. If it's not, they won't. And it tends to be the case, lo and behold, that MPs are incredibly factional beings. So if you've got a dominant faction in the parliamentary Labour Party that doesn't like its leader, then, oh, wow, any issue that you could possibly put on the front page of a newspaper is going to get there if it's damaging to the leader. And in this case, it's not. So no one's going to talk about it. It'll get forgotten. There'll be one sort of reasonably damaging article in The Independent, which will get shared on Twitter, and that'll be the end of it.
Well, I suppose in times like this, we need an independent media outlet that is people-powered. And maybe if you wanted to support that independent media outlet that is people-powered, you could go to novaramedia.com/support. First, Israel's war cabinet fell apart. Now, the state is at loggerheads with the army that serves as its backbone. Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson Daniel Hagari has appeared to publicly challenge Israel's prime minister. Now, Hagari is a familiar face to those who've been following Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza. He's probably well known to all of you. He has been front and centre since the Hamas attacks of 7th October, denying claims that the IDF have been committing war crimes and genocide in Gaza. But now Hagari has come out to say that Hamas cannot be defeated.
Hamas is an idea. Hamas is a party, and it is implanted in people's hearts. Whoever thinks that we can demolish Hamas is wrong. It is the Muslim Brotherhood that has been present in the region for many years. But what can be done is to create something else to replace it and make the population realize that there is another party. It distributes food and provides social services. Who is this party that replaces Hamas at the political level? And is this the way to weaken Hamas? I cannot discuss the alternatives. The political leadership must decide, and the army implements the decision. But the issue that Hamas can be destroyed and Hamas can disappear is just to throw dust into the public's eyes. If we do not bring something else as an alternative in Gaza, Hamas will remain.
Now, who has been saying Hamas can be destroyed over and over and over again? Benjamin Netanyahu. And he said it again following Hagari's comments. Netanyahu's office released a statement saying the Prime Minister had defined the destruction of Hamas's military and governing capabilities as one of the goals of the war. The Israeli military, of course, is committed to this. This is pretty big. The IDF's top spokesperson has essentially accused Netanyahu of misleading the Israeli public and admitted Hamas cannot be defeated. This is open rebellion, and Israel is a militarized society. It is built on that military. This idea that Hamas cannot be defeated is also something people have been saying from the very beginning of this latest episode in Israel's assaults on Gaza. This is from a piece published in The Nation by Tony Caron and Daniel Levy in December 2023, 8 weeks into the war, and it was titled, "Israel is Losing This War." Western politicians and media like to fantasize that Hamas is a ISIS-style nihilistic cadre holding Palestinian society hostage. Hamas is, in fact, a multifaceted political movement rooted in the fabric and national aspirations of Palestinian society. It embodies a belief, grimly affirmed by decades of Palestinian experience, that armed resistance is central to the Palestinian liberation project because of the failures of the Oslo process and the intractable hostility of its adversary. And its influence and popularity have grown as Israel and its allies keep thwarting a peace process and other non-violent strategies for pursuing Palestinian liberation. You think about Hamas and you think about what's happened to Palestinians in Gaza over the last X amount of months, and all that's happened is they have been pummeled, they've been killed, they have been displaced, they have seen Gaza ruined, razed to the ground. And every time a ceasefire is on the table, you have a rejection from Israel and the US. And you imagine that those conditions are not going to give rise to further adherence or signing up to the fact that the only way that there will be liberation in Palestine is through meeting fire with fire. Michael, what do you think it means that top IDF representatives are openly defying Netanyahu? Could Israel be forced into a ceasefire? Are we going to see the IDF mutiny? Would that lead to a ceasefire?
I suppose I'm not expert enough to know whether there could possibly be a mutiny. I suppose it's probably no coincidence that this comes at the same time that Benny Gantz has sort of left the war cabinet. Benny Gantz, a former general, so very close to the military. Netanyahu, of course, more of a political animal. He's been a politician for decades, whereas Benny Gantz, much more recently, was a top figure in the IDF. I suppose looking at sort of Israeli internal politics, I think there's a mistake that sort of Western liberals sometimes make, which is to say there is a sort of there's a part of the Israeli political establishment which wants a greater Israel and wants to see sort of the Palestinians completely subjugated and doesn't want a two-state solution. And then there's the extremist who's Netanyahu, who wants the greater Israel, who doesn't want a two-state solution. That's nonsense. Everyone in the top of the Israeli political establishment at the moment seems fairly committed to a greater Israel, does have no interest whatsoever in a Palestinian state, and doesn't seem to shed any tears when tens of thousands of Palestinians get killed. But I think you probably are seeing some division now between people who are acting, Netanyahu very much acting just in his own self-interest at this point, so his own political survival, whereas Benny Gantz is thinking, well, and the IDF, sort of the military, sort of in terms of the interests of the state. And the interests of the state, aren't a two-state solution. People, I think, sometimes like to kid themselves that it's sort of Israel's national self-interest to make peace with the Palestinians. It's probably not, right? The Israelis can, if they want, if no one stops them, they probably can have a greater Israel. They can do sort of the slow, gentle ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. I mean, obviously, ethnic cleansing is never gentle, but the sort of in the West Bank, it's this sort of slow, continuous process as opposed to the dramatic genocidal catastrophe we're seeing in Gaza right now. They probably can do that, just as the whites in apartheid South Africa probably could have maintained their power for a very long time, and you would have had, within the apartheid white establishment, you would have had some people who used harsher languages, who sounded a bit more extreme, and then you would have had people who said, let's try and make our apartheid look a bit more reasonable. The only thing that changed the dial was massive external pressure to say, no, that's no longer an option that you can have. And I mean, the same thing is going to apply to Israel, right? The only way that, I think most people are probably thinking, obviously a ceasefire is better than no ceasefire. But if you're looking at Benny Gantz, the military versus Netanyahu, in either case, you are looking at a somewhat genocidal process going on. You're looking at ethnic cleansing. You're looking at the formation of a greater Israel. You're looking at the undermining of any possibility of a future Palestinian state. So I do think, sort of in terms of the immediate future, obviously a ceasefire really matters because people are still getting killed every day in Gaza. There's no point in saying, oh, in the big scheme of things, a ceasefire doesn't matter. A ceasefire does matter. But this sort of focus on internal factional disputes within the Israeli establishment, which I think it's important for us to do, by the way, shouldn't distract from the fact that the only thing which is going to bring about any kind of reasonable possibility of life for Palestinians is going to be massive external pressure.
I do want to just double down on the fact there is no such thing as gentle ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is never gentle. It just sometimes is done in a way that the West can look away from when it happens. And right now the West is trying to look away, but because it's of such a scale and concentration, it simply can't. And also because we have access to the internet. But ethnic cleansing is never gentle. It just might happen on a smaller scale, but it's devastating for the lives of the people that are directly affected by it. I also think with South Africa, remember it was internal resistance first. So something changes within the internal setup. There was always a resistance that comes first. People resist every single day. You look at the transatlantic slave movement, for example. Something that I learned from doing work upon that was, there's this idea of like the abolition movement that seems to just, this immaculate conception of the abolition movement, and suddenly there was all this external pressure that just came and we decided to stop slavery. No, every single day people resisted the violence, the genocidal nature of the transatlantic slave trade. Every single day people chose to resist, whether that was through rebellion, whether that was through literally removing themselves from life, whether that's from running away, whether that was from organizing together. There was resistance on different scales every single day, and that adds up and adds up and adds up until that external pressure is also part of the factors. And one of the things that is argued in the piece that Daniel Levy and Tony Caron write about Israel losing this war is that what Hamas have done is just completely blow up the status quo. With October 7th, what they did was blow up the status quo in a very violent way. But it has reset the dial. Unfortunately, the cost of that might be, this horrendous genocide. But we don't know how it's going to fall out. We don't know what the resolution to that is going to be, but it has reset the status quo in some way. Whether that's going to preserve lives in the long run, we will see. But like we say, we cover all these different stories. We talk about the election, but we cannot forget that while we are doing this every single day, that this ethnic cleansing is going on at such a horrific scale that it seems unmatched by anything else in the world at the moment. With 2 weeks to go until election day, the NHS remains one of the biggest factors in how people will choose to vote. On BBC Newsnight, the health representatives from the Tories, Labour, the Lib Dems and the SNP were confronted by an audience who painted a stark picture of the state of our health service.
I remember getting the date for my surgery and thinking, this must be a mistake. This cannot be right. So I don't know if people are aware of PALS, but I think all hospitals have them. It's a sort of listening service for patients. And I called PALS at my hospital to say, there's a 62-day target for the NHS for starting cancer treatment, and I'm looking down the barrel of 4.5 months. And the woman on the phone laughed. And said, she laughed, so I don't hold it against her, but it just, for me, it sort of shows the culture that exists in that particular hospital and presumably in others, where the very idea that a patient would expect that target to be met is laughed at.
Trying to get an appointment with a doctor is hard at this point in time. Trying to access talking therapies. I've been given a 2-year waiting list.
2 years?
2-year waiting list to speak to somebody.
I went to the GP about a possible ADHD diagnosis a couple of years ago now, and I was told to fill out the relevant questionnaire. They checked that over. They said I'd be put on a waiting list. They said the waiting list for the diagnosis would be about a year. The next time I speak to them about a year later, they say that they didn't actually put me on the waiting list, but they can see the record of the appointment where they said that they would. They just didn't put me on.
I've been waiting for nearly 2 weeks now to have a doctor's appointment. I phoned them at 8 o'clock in the morning, as they asked us, but by you get into queue, and by 8:30 they phone you, say all appointments have gone.
There's actually memes about trying to get an appointment at the GP. Now, the first speaker there was Stevie, who was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 37. Imagine discovering that you have a potentially terminal illness in the prime of your life and being laughed at when you try to get treated within the clinically recommended waiting times. That is literally someone laughing about the outcomes of your illness growing potentially worse with each passing day. Those anecdotal stories about the NHS are matched by the data. Since 2010, the number of people seeking treatment for cancer in England has grown, and also growing is the proportion of those waiting more than 62 days to receive life-saving treatment. Now that's represented by the red bars versus the blues, which show those seen within the target. In 2012, less than 20% of patients found it difficult to get a GP appointment. That's the mustard line. By 2023, it was more than half. And when it comes to mental health appointment waiting lists, well, we don't know the true extent of the backlog due to poor data collection. But in November last year, it was revealed for the first time that tens of thousands of children and young people were on a 2-year waiting list for community mental health appointments. So, what did the politicians have to say about the almost criminal decline of our health service? This was current Health Minister Maria Caulfield.
I'm very sorry that people have had those waits, and particularly in the breast cancer setting. I was a breast cancer nurse before I came into Parliament, and improving outcomes for breast cancer has been something I've worked hard on throughout my NHS career.
So why the delays,
if you look across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom, there are similar delays in all, whether it's Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, or in England, which I'm responsible for.
But is that supposed to be some kind of consolation?
To try and improve those waits. Well, I think we have been through a period of COVID where routine testing and routine services, whether that's for physical or mental health, have not been available for 2 years, and people are presenting much sicker than they would had we not had those lockdowns.
So the problem with the NHS is COVID. No, COVID was the final straw that broke the NHS's back, is not the root cause of why the NHS is crumbling. The NHS is crumbling because it's under-resourced, because staff are leaving in droves, because the individual trusts are mismanaged, disorganised, because the workflow is not what it should be, because it's a big, huge beast that has grown outwards bit by bit, and we haven't maintained different parts of it. It's like building, a block of flats and adding different extensions. It becomes this Frankenstein's monster, and you haven't actually made it coherent and cohesive and work together. The NHS get loads of money, but the money doesn't go to the right bits. It's under-resourced. Also, where was Maria Caulfield phoning in from? Where's she at? Of course, the Tories are pretty much irrelevant now when it comes to the near future. So let's see what the other parties had to say. Health is a devolved issue, meaning Scotland is in charge of the Scottish NHS. The SNP's Scottish Health Secretary, Neil Gray, gave his take on why the NHS isn't working.
Yes, there are pressures in all elements of the health service, not just in Scotland, but across all nations of the UK. COVID has undoubtedly had an impact. We are seeing more patients presenting in Scotland than we have done before, and we're seeing more patients within the treatment time guarantees, the 31-day and the 62-day pathway, than we did prior to COVID.
Sure.
But on this, Wes Streeting was absolutely right when he said that all roads lead back to Westminster, because the cuts that have come to the NHS in England have a direct impact on our ability in Scotland and indeed in Wales and other parts of the UK to be able to fund the services.
No, but health is devolved. You can choose to fund it in different ways, can't you? You can raise taxes in Scotland.
And we're doing that, Victoria. We're doing that. We're taking responsibility for the health service in Scotland.
So why are you blaming Westminster then?
No, I'll come to that, because we've raised an additional £1.5 billion in tax in order to invest in public services. What we're getting from Labour and the Conservatives is a plan for continued austerity and a plan for £18 billion worth of cuts.
Now, Neil Gray isn't being completely fair there, because Labour has remained silent on the £18 billion in public service cuts forecast by the end of the next Parliament if the party is to meet its own fiscal rules, unless Labour acts to avert them. That's austerity for sure. But those cuts are to unprotected budgets, while the NHS budget is protected. Victoria Derbyshire put the austerity point to Wes Streeting, the man who will be in charge of the NHS in just a fortnight.
If Labour win the election, austerity is coming, is it not? Be honest.
No, it's not. And the £2 billion we've already committed in our manifesto would make a real difference in every one of the cases we've just heard about this evening.
That is a tiny amount of money when you look at the total budget of the NHS in England, which is 190 billion.
Well,
2 billion is a drop.
Well, hang on a sec. I'd say two things about that, and I want to explain what we will do about the state of the NHS. The first thing I'd say generally is, if it were the case that it was just pouring more money in would solve all the problems, then we wouldn't simultaneously have the highest amount of cash being spent on the NHS, which we do today, and the worst crisis in its history. When Andrew Lansley came in after the 2010 election, the Conservatives spent £3 billion on the NHS. All of it went into a top-down reorganisation that nobody wanted, nobody voted for, and left the NHS in a state where waiting lists were at their highest level ever before the pandemic. It's not a virtue to spend loads more money if the money is badly spent.
I mean, he's kind of saying what I said, which is the NHS does have loads of money sent to it, but it's under-resourced. However, I know Wes Streeting is a big fan of involving the private sector more in public healthcare, which is an incredibly worrying creep for what that could mean for our health service, because we already know that PFI contracts in key institutions like education, like health, has not led to better services, but instead led to more strangled services. Just look at academies and schools, some of the worst environments you can be with as a child. I think the other point to make there is, don't spend the money badly then. But what about that £2 billion increased spending commitment Labour has made? Victoria Derbyshire went back to it.
It's an increase in health spending under Labour. This is what you're offering, of 1.1%. In austerity, under the coalition, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, it went up 1.4%. I mean, you're just behind austerity.
No, I just don't accept.
Well, I've just given you the figures.
It's worse than that.
I just don't accept that it's a virtue to spend more money without doing the reform as well.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's a virtue.
About the cost of living crisis, one of the things that makes where we are today much more difficult than 1997 isn't just the state of the NHS, it's the state of the economy and the state of the finances of every family in this country, which means that whereas the last Labour government was able to say, we'll put a penny on national insurance and put the money in the NHS, if we said we're going to put a penny on national insurance, there'd be loads of people who who want to see investment in the NHS, who would say, I genuinely can't afford to pay higher taxes. I can't afford my rent. I can't afford my mortgages. I can't afford my bill. We are realistic about the challenges that we face. And it's investment and reform that delivers the results. We delivered the shortest waiting times, the highest patient satisfaction ever in the history of the NHS when we were last in government.
Yeah, but you were spending loads more money then.
One thing about that is obviously he's listed a lot of pressures that people have on them, which is why they feel they can't pay more tax. You know, like I can't afford to pay my rent, I can't afford to pay my mortgage, I can't afford to pay my bills. And Labour claim they have plans for tackling this, but I think we've covered them quite a lot. They're not really comprehensive enough. They don't plan to spend enough money to really do it. The obvious answer is, why don't you bring in stuff like rent controls? Why don't you make it so that people have affordable housing? And why don't you make it so you've actually properly renationalised the train so you don't have to spend loads of money? Why don't you make it so that we actually have infrastructure we can access at a low cost rather than having to pay loads of money just to eat, sleep, breathe? But no, it means instead we simply cannot, think about raising taxes because all this other stuff is high. And I get it. I get that. It feels impossible. I wouldn't want more, I wouldn't want higher outcomes right now. But if everything else was lowered, if there was a way to sort that out, who knows, then yeah, I'd pay loads more tax for better services. Anyway, I want to play you one more clip from the audience. This was Paul from Coventry.
I have an 88-year-old mother and an 88-year-old father. My mother fell out of the bed and my father is not strong enough now to lift her off the floor. Calls the paramedics and they say 1 hour. So he gets her a cushion and puts a duvet over her and makes her comfortable. 1 hour goes, no paramedics. Calls them again. Sorry, we're really, really busy. We'll be another hour. Another hour goes. He calls them again. Sorry, we're really busy tonight. We're going to send an ambulance from Stoke-on-Trent an hour away to get to my mother who's been on the floor for 3 hours. Yeah? It's not on. You need to do something about this. I've had a situation where the paramedics took me in and waited 6 hours before they left because they weren't allowed to leave me until I'd been seen in a corridor. 9 hours I was in a corridor.
I mean, I've had stories like this racking up, people who are being passed from person to person, or rather medical professional to medical professional. There's no one there to see them at the, the first point of contact. They're waiting hours and hours to be seen for injuries or illnesses. In A&E is so oversubscribed because you can't go to, get an appointment at the GP in the first place. So people who are having the emergencies can't be seen either. And it's such a failure on every level. And Labour have to have real solutions for this because it's not going to get better in the short term. There's not going to suddenly, Labour's going to be elected and the NHS will go, oh, Labour's in government now. Phew, the pressure's already off. Like, something has to be done straight away from day one. Let's see what Wes Streeting said about what might be done from day one.
We've got a situation now where the ambulance delays are atrocious right across the country. There have been particular problems here in the West Midlands, but it's true right across the country. Problems with ambulance handovers. You've got hospitals that are completely clogged up. And I think
What's the answer?
The answer to that, I think, there's twofold. You have to try and reduce the pressure at the front door of the hospital. So going back to the point about general practice, I think it's crazy, by the way, we've got this situation where we've got qualified GPs who can't find a job and patients who can't get a GP appointment. I do want to see more diverse roles in general practice, but the current scheme is obviously far too restrictive and there's a lack of common sense, and I will absolutely look at that. But we also need to train up thousands more GPs. There are 2,000 fewer GPs now. Okay. You're doing 1 million more appointments than before the pandemic, so we need to train up more GPs, cut through the red tape that holds you back, make sure you can spend more time with the family-doctor relationship, more incentives into continuity of care for that family-doctor relationship, and that will make a big difference at the front door. The exit door in social care, we've got to deal with delayed discharge. I was at a hospital in London the other day. 60 days a patient had been on a ward, fit to go home, but there wasn't the care in the community. Now that costs and this goes back to my point about, I know money's an issue, but it goes back to the point about reform. Thousands of pounds would be spent on keeping that patient in a hospital bed every day. It would be cheaper to spend a fraction of that money with support either in an intermediate step-down hospital or in their home. Similarly, if you can get a GP appointment, it costs 40 quid, A&E £400. So, you know, I understand people say more money for the NHS. Of course, that's what I want to deliver to, and we will.
OK.
But also look at the £170 million that's going in now. Look at the waste, look at the inefficiency, look at that crazy red tape we heard described in general practice.
Let me go to Marie Caulfield.
We need to reform the way the NHS works. Otherwise, we will just pour more and more money into the system like water into a leaky bucket and wonder, as we are today, how it is that a Prime Minister can say we're spending more than ever before, and yet we see the NHS has never been in such a grave crisis.
I kind of agree. Like, I agree with Wes Streeting. I think we just disagree on the solutions. And healthcare professionals I've talked to have also noted, you know, the same concerns that Streeting outlines there in terms of this idea of pouring money into a leaky bucket. The problem is, when you get the diversion ideology is when you get to this idea that, oh, you know, the NHS isn't fit for purpose and therefore we should strip it back and strip it for parts and all of this kind of stuff. And there's varying degrees of that, from Nigel Farage, who thinks, you know, privatise the whole lot, to Wes Streeting is like, bring in more private contracts, make it work more efficiently. That's how it works, because obviously business is where efficiency lies, which is total balls. There's nothing about private business that makes it more efficient than the public sector if you actually invest in the public sector. Anyway, you know, you said train more GPs, improve care in the community, reform the NHS to eliminate waste. None of that's actually costed in Labour's manifesto. And that means that if Labour government is going to pay for that programme anytime soon, it will maybe be coming from that austerity forecast of £18 billion in cuts to other public services. Or we might see significant tax rises as the Labour government goes on. Unless, of course, they abandon their fiscal rules, something Rachel Reeves has promised won't happen. God, please. One more U-turn, that's all we're asking for. Either way, Labour's not exactly playing straight with the electorate. Michael, do you think Labour will abandon its fiscal rules to sort out stuff like the NHS, the, you know, education, these big beasts that would ensure they might actually be able to fix the country? Or is Rachel Reeves ruling that party with an iron fist?
Well, I mean, they need the NHS to improve, right? So I think they would prefer to break their fiscal rules than have an NHS which is falling flat on its face. So they are going to find some money somewhere. Maybe it's going to be by stealth tax increases. They can, you know, do these changes at the Bank of England that everyone's talking about. I think they will find some money. In terms of wastage, you know, looking back at New Labour, so the last Labour government did have a pretty decent record when it came to the NHS. They got waiting lists down. By the time they left government, people were very happy with it. Now, there were some things sort of that New Labour did that I think people will probably recognise were a mistake. So PFI being the main one. And PFI is not necessarily because, you know, private industries are necessarily going to be less efficient than the public, or they're going to cream off, you know, loads and loads of profits. The only reason that was done was as an accounting trick, right? It's because Gordon Brown didn't want to break his own fiscal rules. So he said, instead of us borrowing money to invest in building hospitals, let's sign a long-term contract so that it doesn't appear in this fiscal year. And I suppose Rachel Reeves' sort of commitment to her fiscal rules is another reason why we might see that sort of stupid accounting trick where you do something which isn't more efficient, which no one's really arguing that the private company is going to maintain the hospital better than the public sector. They're just doing it to keep it off the balance sheet. So I think that's a disaster. At the same time, I think what New Labour did reasonably well was the whole kind of target stuff. I think they did give hospitals a lot of targets, did kind of work. And what they did in public service and the public sector in general was to say, we'll give you more money and we'll be a bit sort of stricter in terms of outcomes. And that combination of more money and sort of incentives and targets, I think, worked reasonably well. What the Conservatives tried to do is say, we're not going to give you any more money, but we are going to increase the need that you have. Not that they increased the need, obviously, that was sort of the process of aging, which they couldn't control. But there is going to be more demand for your services in the NHS. We're not going to keep up your funding with that demand. And we're going to hope for reforms as a way of improving stuff on the cheap. And I think reforms as improving stuff on the cheap doesn't work. If you do it in combination with more money, then I think it probably can work. So I'm not completely dismissive of sort of Wes Streeting talking about sort of we need reform as well as money. But you are right, Moya, it's sort of they need to find that money somewhere.
And it's actually down the back of my sofa. On another point of that, what do you make of Wes Streeting himself? You know, both in that Newsnight Special as the man who'd been charged with the NHS. I actually met someone recently who used to work in the NHS, you know, now is actually in another healthcare field, in the private field. And they were very unimpressed by most of the politicians, but they said the one that they were impressed by is Wes Streeting. So I'm interested to know what you think personally and what you think the public is making of Wes Streeting.
Yeah, the public like him, I think. I mean, he's a coherent speaker. I mean, in terms of Wes Streeting, I think there are many sort of points where we'd have massively different sort of goals in mind, right? So if you're looking at foreign policy, if you're looking at Israel-Palestine, he's really on the right, right? Really on the right. Sort of Tony Blair-esque in sort of his neoconservatism. I think he's also a deeply cynical politician who's somewhat self-serving, very, very ambitious, very willing to sort of attack people who he doesn't think will promote him. I think that's in large part what was going on under Jeremy Corbyn. Now, with sort of his particular job in terms of the NHS, you know, I'm not sure how different mine and his goals are. You know, Labour want it to work more effectively. They want the waiting list to go down. They don't want the doctors to go on strike, right? I don't think that Wes Streeting is going in there saying, what I want to do is privatise the NHS so that we can destroy it. You know, maybe he is. Maybe he's more cynical than even I imagine. But I think he probably will bring that sort of new Labour ethos of we have to make it work by whatever means necessary. Maybe he's got a bit of a sort of ideological bias towards the private sector. I'm not sure. But, you know, I wouldn't rule out him being an effective health secretary. I suppose I'm not expert enough to sort of know. I mean, it's positive, as you say, of sort of people in the healthcare sector impressed by.
Now, before we finish, a quick plug for an excellent video that came out on our channel today. Aaron Bastani visited Suella Braverman's constituency of Fareham and Waterlooville to find out what the public there think of her.
The Conservatives have betrayed us.
So you won't be voting for Suella Braverman?
I'm offended that you're leaving us.
She should be put in jail.
I don't really follow it, mate. They're all the same to me. We've lived off these two parties for the last 100 years. And what have they done? Absolutely fuck all.
The whole political system in Britain's a mess.
You're given the right to vote, you should vote.
It's just a bit of a dive, really, now.
The world is not a democracy.
I don't want a pineapple, no. You sound like an old school Labour voter.
Of course, I nearly had a heart attack.
If you want to see more of that video, it's up on our channel and the link is also in the description below. And if you want to support our video journalism, which we're hoping to do much, much more of, then go to novaramedia.com.support. No, that's not it. It's novaramedia.com/support. I should know this by now, but sometimes we're all fallible. Come on, forgive me. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. Come back into our channel in an hour's time when the man we have just been complimenting will be here himself. Aaron Bastani will be hosting the coverage of the BBC Question Time election special. For now, you have been watching Novara Media. Good night.